Ladies and gentlemen, Hercule Poirot here. Someone is lying, and I intend to find out who.
The telegram arrived at our Baker Street lodgings on a fog-shrouded Thursday morning in November, its urgent phrasing cutting through the comfortable routine of breakfast like a blade through silk. I had been reading aloud from the morning paper, some tedious parliamentary debate, when Poirot, with his characteristic precision, slit open the yellow envelope with his silver paper knife. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, his green eyes scanning the brief message. "Hastings, we are summoned to Surrey. It appears that a butler has developed an inconvenient habit of confessing to murder at midnight." I set down my cup with interest. A confession? Surely that simplifies matters considerably. Poirot's smile was enigmatic as he passed me the telegram. "Read, mon ami, and tell me if you find it so simple." The message was from Inspector Meadows of the Surrey Constabulary. "Urgent assistance required. Stop. Lady Margaret Thornfield murdered. Stop Butler, confessed midnight. Stop circumstances. Peculiar, stop your expertise. Invaluable, stop." Peculiar circumstances, I mused. What could be peculiar about a straightforward confession? "Precisely the question that intrigues me," Poirot replied, rising from his chair with characteristic deliberation. "When a man confesses to murder before the crime is even discovered by others, it suggests either remarkable honesty or remarkable calculation. In my experience, Hastings, midnight confessions are rarely what they appear to be." Within 2 hours, we found ourselves traveling through the Surrey countryside in a hired motor car, the autumn landscape blurring past in shades of gold and amber. Poirot had spent the journey in contemplative silence, occasionally adjusting his moustache or straightening his already immaculate tie, sure signs that his little grey cells were working at full capacity. Thornfield House emerged from the morning mist like something from a Gothic novel, its Georgian facade imposing despite the circumstances that had brought us there. Inspector Meadows, a competent-looking man with greying whiskers, met us at the entrance with evident relief. "Monsieur Poirot, thank goodness you've come. This business has us all thoroughly perplexed. The butler, fellow named Pemberton, walked into the village station at precisely midnight, calm as you please, and announced that he'd murdered Lady Thornfield. When the constable asked him how, he simply said, 'With the letter opener in the study,' and refused to say another word." "And Lady Thornfield?" Poirot inquired. "Found dead in her study at dawn, exactly as Pemberton described. Letter opener through the heart, very neat and precise. Door locked from the inside, key on her person. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Open and shut case, you'd think, except—" "Except?" Poirot prompted. Meadows shifted uncomfortably. "Except that Pemberton has served the family for 37 years without so much as a harsh word, and there's the matter of the house party. Lady Thornfield was entertaining guests for her 70th birthday celebration. Her nephew, Mr. Charles Thornfield, stands to inherit everything. Then there's Miss Diana Marsh, Lady Thornfield's companion, and Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the family physician. All were present in the house when the murder occurred. A closed circle," Poirot observed with satisfaction, "and each, no doubt, with their own secrets and motivations. Tell me, Inspector, what was the atmosphere during this birthday celebration?" "Tense, according to the staff. Lady Thornfield had been making changes to her will, apparently. The solicitor, Mr. Blackwood, was expected the following morning to finalize the documents. There'd been heated discussions all evening about family finances and inheritance." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And where was our confessing butler during these heated discussions?" "That's just it, Monsieur Poirot. According to the other servants, Pemberton was in the kitchen until nearly 11:30, helping prepare the late supper service. Multiple witnesses place him there until just before midnight. Hardly enough time to commit murder, lock the door from inside, escape, and walk to the village station." "Ah," Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Now we begin to see why you found the circumstances peculiar. A confession that defies the physical evidence. How fascinating. And tell me, what does our midnight confessor say when questioned about this timing? Nothing at all. He simply repeats, "I killed Lady Thornfield with the letter opener," and falls silent. It's as if he's reciting a prepared statement and refuses to deviate from it. As we approached the house, I could see faces at various windows. The surviving members of the house party, no doubt, watching our arrival with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Each would have their story, their alibi, their carefully constructed version of events. But Poirot, I knew, would see through their facades to the psychological truths beneath. "Come, Hastings," he said, straightening his coat. "Let us meet this butler who confesses so conveniently, and these guests who celebrate birthdays so unfortunately. I suspect we shall find that midnight confessions, like midnight itself, often conceal more than they reveal." The interior of Thornfield House breathed with the weight of old money and older secrets, its mahogany-paneled corridors lined with stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow our progress with silent disapproval. Inspector Meadows led us first through the scene of the crime, Lady Thornfield's study, a spacious room dominated by an enormous carved oak desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held the musty scent of leather-bound volumes and something else, the faint, metallic tang that lingered after violence. Though Lady Thornfield's body had been removed, the chalk outline on the Persian carpet told its story. Poirot approached with his characteristic methodical precision, his keen eyes absorbing every detail, the position of the chair, scattered papers on the desk, the ornate letter opener now sealed in evidence. "The weapon," he observed, studying the silver blade through its transparent covering. "An antique piece, no? Part of a desk set, I would imagine, heavy enough to penetrate the heart, yet requiring considerable force and precise aim. Not the weapon one would choose for a crime of passion." Exactly what struck me as odd. Meadows agreed. Pemberton is well into his 60s, not a large man, and Lady Thornfield, despite her age, was quite robust. Yet there are no defensive wounds, no signs she fought back or even saw the attack coming. Poirot examined the scattered documents with interest. "What papers are these, Inspector?" "Preliminary notes for her will revision. She'd been making significant changes. The servants were to receive substantial bequests, including Pemberton, who was to inherit £5,000 and a cottage on the property." "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A man kills the benefactor who plans to reward his decades of faithful service. The psychology, it does not align." He moved to examine the locked door, running his fingers along the frame. The key was found on Lady Thornfield's person, in her dress pocket. The French doors to the garden were also latched from inside. A perfect locked room, yet somehow our butler manages to commit murder and escape to make his midnight confession. After examining the undisturbed flower beds beyond the terrace, we proceeded to meet the confessing butler himself. Pemberton sat rigidly in a small antechamber, impeccably dressed in his uniform, silver hair neatly combed. His pale face was devoid of emotion. No fear, no remorse, no defiance. He looked less like a murderer than a man awaiting a particularly tedious appointment. "Mr. Pemberton," Poirot said with characteristic politeness, "I am Hercule Poirot. We are here to understand what transpired last night." The butler's startling blue eyes turned toward us slowly. "I killed Lady Thornfield," he stated, his voice flat and mechanical, "with the letter opener in the study." "Indeed, a very precise statement. Tell me, why did you kill Lady Thornfield?" Pemberton's gaze returned to its fixed point on the wall. "I killed Lady Thornfield." Nothing more. The same mechanical repetition, as if he were a gramophone record stuck on a single, incriminating groove. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing. The slight tremor in Pemberton's left hand, the rhythmic twitching of a muscle in his clenched jaw. "You have served Lady Thornfield for many years, I understand?" 37 years, sir. "And you were fond of her?" Silence. Then the mechanical repetition, "I killed Lady Thornfield." "The inspector tells me you were in the kitchen until nearly 11:30, yet you claim the murder occurred earlier. The village station is not a short walk. How did you manage both the crime and your timely confession?" Again, the same response, delivered without variation or explanation. Poirot rose, his gaze lingering on the butler's unnatural stillness. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. We shall return, I'm sure." In the corridor, I voiced my frustration. "He's either mad or protecting someone, Poirot." That mechanical repetition was chilling. "Precisely, Hastings. A confession without detail, without motive, without logical consistency. It serves to obfuscate rather than clarify." Poirot stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "He presents a solid wall, but even the most solid walls have cracks, if one knows where to look." We were interrupted by the arrival of a tall, well-dressed man in his 40s. Charles Thornfield, Lady Thornfield's nephew and heir. His handshake was firm but brief, his pale blue eyes assessing us with barely concealed impatience. "I understand you gentlemen have some reputation in these matters," he said stiffly. "Frankly, I can't see why this requires elaborate investigation," the butler confessed. "Surely that's sufficient." "You seem eager to see the matter concluded, Monsieur Thornfield," Poirot observed mildly. "Perhaps you could tell us about yesterday evening's atmosphere during your aunt's birthday celebration?" A shadow crossed Thornfield's features. It was strained, I'll admit. Aunt Margaret had been making dramatic pronouncements about her will, seeming to take perverse pleasure in keeping us all in suspense. "And your own expectations regarding the inheritance?" "I am her only surviving relative," he replied stiffly. But Aunt Margaret had developed eccentric ideas about charity and social responsibility. She spoke of leaving substantial sums to various causes, to the servants, even to that companion of hers, Diana Marsh. As Thornfield stalked away, clearly affronted by Poirot's gentle probing, my friend turned to me with satisfaction. "Already, mon ami, the psychology begins to reveal itself. Our heir protests too much, and his eagerness to accept Pemberton's confession suggests he has reasons for wanting this investigation concluded swiftly. Come, let us meet the remaining players in this midnight drama." We found Miss Diana Marsh in the morning room, arranging white chrysanthemums in a crystal vase with the careful precision of someone seeking distraction from grief. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with prematurely silver hair and intelligent dark eyes that held traces of recent tears. Her black mourning dress was simple but well cut, suggesting refined taste within modest means. "Miss Marsh," Poirot began with his customary bow, "please accept our condolences. I understand you served as Lady Thornfield's companion for several years." "7 years," she replied, setting down the flowers with trembling hands. "Lady Margaret was more than an employer. She became like family to me. This business with Pemberton is simply incomprehensible. He adored her, would never have harmed a hair on her head. Yet he confesses with remarkable consistency," I observed. Miss Marsh's composure wavered. "That's precisely what makes it so disturbing. Yesterday evening, Pemberton seemed perfectly normal. Attentive, courteous, perhaps a bit tired from the birthday preparations. There was nothing to suggest this." Poirot settled into his chair with deliberate care. "Tell us about yesterday evening, mademoiselle. The atmosphere, the conversations." A flush colored her cheeks. Lady Margaret had been in a peculiar mood for weeks, ever since she decided to revise her will. She seemed to take delight in dropping hints about her intentions, watching how people reacted. It was unlike her usual directness. "And your own expectations regarding these changes?" She had hinted that my years of service would be recognized, Miss Marsh admitted quietly. "Perhaps enough to allow me some independence, a small cottage or funds to open the bookshop I've always dreamed of." Without such provision, she glanced toward the window. "I must find another position immediately. Companions are not easily placed at my age. Most distressing, Poirot murmured sympathetically. And the evening's events? We dined at 8. Lady Margaret was in particularly high spirits, almost mischievous. She announced that Mr. Blackwood would arrive this morning to finalize her new will, and that we would all be quite surprised by her decisions. Around 10 o'clock, she retired to her study, saying she had correspondence to attend to. Her usual habit? Yes, though typically I would bring her cocoa at 10:30. Last night, however, she rang for Pemberton instead, saying she preferred not to be disturbed. I thought it odd, but Lady Margaret could be unpredictable. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. She specifically requested Pemberton rather than accepting your usual service. Yes, I learned this from the kitchen maid later. Pemberton seemed surprised by the summons, but went immediately, as always. Our interview was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a distinguished gentleman of 60 with silver whiskers, and the confident bearing of a successful physician. His medical bag suggested recent professional duties. "Gentlemen, Miss Marsh," he nodded briskly. "I've just completed my examination of Pemberton. Most peculiar case. He shows no signs of mental deterioration or emotional instability. His responses are mechanical, yes, but he's clearly aware of his surroundings and the implications of his statements." "Could he be under any influence?" Poirot inquired. "I found no evidence of drugs or alcohol. His pupils are normal, reflexes sharp. It's as if he's deliberately limiting his responses to that single incriminating statement." "Dr. Hartwell," Poirot continued, "you have known the family for many years. What is your assessment of Pemberton's character?" The doctor settled into a chair with professional gravity. "Exemplary. Lady Margaret trusted him completely. He managed household operations, handled her correspondence, even assisted with her charitable endeavors, which makes his confession utterly baffling." "And your own relationship with Lady Thornfield?" "Patient and physician for 15 years, though we became genuine friends. I often advised her on charitable donations, particularly those concerning medical research." He paused meaningfully. "She had expressed interest in funding a research initiative I'm developing. It would have been a substantial contribution." "You were present in the house last evening?" "I dined with the family and retired to the guest wing around 10:30. I heard nothing unusual during the night." Miss Marsh nodded confirmation. Dr. Hartwell and I remained in the drawing room until nearly 11:30, discussing Lady Margaret's health. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour just as he was saying good night. As we took our leave, Poirot remained thoughtfully silent until we reached the corridor. "Fascinating, Hastings. Everyone provides Pemberton with character references that contradict his confession, yet no one can explain his mechanical repetition of guilt. And observe, Lady Thornfield breaks her established routine on the very night of her murder, specifically requesting the man who now confesses to killing her. You suspect the confession is false?" "I suspect, mon ami, that we are watching a carefully orchestrated performance. But whether Pemberton is the director or merely the lead actor, that remains to be determined." We found Mr. Blackwood, the family solicitor, in the library, surrounded by neat stacks of legal documents that spoke of decades of meticulous service to the Thornfield family. A thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of one who deals in absolutes. He rose courteously as we entered, though his expression remained troubled. "Gentlemen, I confess this business has left me quite shaken," he began, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "I've served as Lady Thornfield's solicitor for 23 years, and never has she seemed more determined about her affairs than in these past weeks." "You were to finalize her new will today, I understand?" Poirot inquired with characteristic directness. "Indeed. She had been revising the document extensively, sending me detailed instructions by post. The changes were substantial." Blackwood glanced toward the door, ensuring our privacy. "The previous will left the bulk of the estate to Mr. Charles Thornfield with modest provisions for the staff. The new will, however, would have transformed those arrangements entirely." "In what manner?" I asked, though Poirot's sharp attention suggested he already suspected the answer. Lady Thornfield wished to establish a charitable trust for medical research. Dr. Hartwell had presented her with a compelling proposal. Another portion was designated for educational scholarships. Miss Marsh was to receive a substantial bequest and lifetime residence rights. The servants, particularly Pemberton, were to be generously rewarded for their faithful service. And Monsieur Charles? Poirot's tone remained neutral, but his green eyes were alert. He would still have inherited a considerable sum, but perhaps a third of what the original will provided. Lady Thornfield was quite firm about this reduction, citing his fiscal irresponsibility and need to learn the value of money through earning it. The implications were immediately clear. Charles Thornfield had not merely lost a fortune. He had been publicly diminished in his aunt's estimation, his inheritance reduced as a deliberate rebuke to his character. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured. "And where is this new will now?" "In my briefcase, unsigned. Legally worthless, I'm afraid. With Lady Thornfield's death, the original will remains in effect, leaving Mr. Charles as principal beneficiary." We found Charles Thornfield in the smoking room, ostensibly reading the morning paper, but clearly agitated. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his collar slightly askew, his fingers drumming restlessly against the leather armchair. When we entered, his pale blue eyes darted between us with barely concealed anxiety. "Any progress with this dreadful business?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Surely Pemberton's confession settles the matter." "You seem eager to see the investigation concluded," Poirot observed mildly. "Perhaps you could tell us about your financial circumstances, Monsieur Thornfield?" The question struck home like a physical blow. Charles's composure cracked visibly, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. "My finances are hardly relevant to a butler's murderous madness. On the contrary, they provide context for understanding why someone might benefit from Lady Thornfield's death before her new will could be executed." "Are you suggesting—" Charles began hotly, then caught himself. "My aunt was difficult, demanding, but I would never—" "Sir, your debts are substantial, I believe," Poirot continued relentlessly. "I've made some unfortunate investments," Charles admitted reluctantly. "Nothing that couldn't be resolved with time and proper management. But Aunt Margaret chose to view my temporary difficulties as moral failings." Our interview was interrupted by Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, who appeared in the doorway with obvious distress. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but you must come at once. I found something in Mr. Pemberton's room, something terrible." We followed her to the servants' quarters, where she led us to Pemberton's modest chamber. From his wardrobe, she withdrew a black overcoat, turning it to reveal a large, dark stain on the left sleeve. "Blood, sir," she whispered. "Dried blood. This coat was clean yesterday morning. I brushed it myself. But when Mr. Pemberton left for the village at midnight, he was wearing it." Inspector Meadows examined the stain grimly. "This corroborates the confession. Physical evidence linking Pemberton to the crime." But Poirot's expression remained thoughtful, almost skeptical. How convenient that such evidence should be discovered so readily, hanging in plain sight. "Tell me, Mrs. Briggs, would Mr. Pemberton normally leave blood-stained clothing so carelessly displayed?" "Never, sir. He's the most particular man about cleanliness and order. In 37 years, I've never known him to leave so much as a speck of dust on his belongings." "Precisely what troubles me," Poirot murmured. "A man meticulous enough to confess with mechanical precision, yet careless enough to preserve the evidence of his crime. It suggests either complete mental collapse or careful arrangement by another hand." As we left the servants' quarters, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to multiply rather than clarify. A confession without emotion, a locked room without explanation, and now evidence that appeared almost too convenient to be genuine. The mechanical nature of Pemberton's repeated statement echoed in my mind. Not the words of a guilty man, but of someone reciting a carefully rehearsed script. The discovery of the blood-stained overcoat seemed to provide Inspector Meadows with the satisfaction of a puzzle completed, each piece falling neatly into its designated place. He stood in the corridor with evident relief, already mentally composing his report for the chief constable. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," he declared with renewed confidence, "I believe we have our case. Confession, motive of sorts, and now physical evidence linking Pemberton directly to the crime. The laboratory will confirm it's Lady Thornfield's blood, but I see no reason to delay the formal charges." Poirot's response was a gentle shake of his head, his green eyes reflecting deep dissatisfaction with such tidy conclusions. "Inspector, you mistake convenience for truth. A case that solves itself so obligingly deserves the most careful scrutiny, not the most rapid acceptance. But surely the evidence speaks for itself. Evidence, mon ami, can be made to speak many languages. The question is whether we are listening to its true voice or merely hearing what someone wishes us to hear." Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. "Indulge me with one more examination of the crime scene. Something continues to disturb the little grey cells." We returned to Lady Thornfield's study, where Poirot began a methodical re-examination with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient manuscripts. He knelt beside the chalk outline, studying the blood patterns with renewed attention. "Observe, Hastings," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with discovery. "The angle of the wound, the position of the body. Lady Thornfield was seated when struck, yet there are no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. For an elderly woman facing a knife-wielding attacker, this suggests either complete trust in her assailant or what? I prompted. Or incapacitation." He moved to examine the fireplace, where faint traces of grey ash had been carefully swept to one corner. "And here, someone burned documents last night. The ashes fresh, gathered with deliberate care. Lady Thornfield destroyed something important shortly before her death." Our investigation was interrupted by Dr. Hartwell's arrival, his expression grave with new discoveries. "Gentlemen, I've completed a more thorough post-mortem examination. The wound shows a precision that troubles me greatly. The letter opener entered between the ribs at exactly the correct angle to reach the heart instantly. It would require considerable anatomical knowledge and an extremely steady hand. The implications struck me immediately. You're suggesting Pemberton couldn't have made such a precise strike?" "More than that," Dr. Hartwell continued. "I've detected traces of chloral hydrate in Lady Thornfield's system, a mild sedative administered perhaps an hour before death. Not enough to cause unconsciousness, but sufficient to induce drowsiness and slow her reflexes considerably." Inspector Meadows frowned. "She was drugged?" "Lightly sedated. It explains the absence of defensive wounds, why she remained seated while being attacked. Someone wanted to ensure she could neither resist nor cry out effectively." Before we could fully absorb these revelations, Mrs. Briggs appeared with a trembling kitchen maid in tow. The young woman, barely 18 and clearly terrified, curtsied awkwardly before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sir, I've been too frightened to speak before, but with all this talk of Mr. Pemberton, last night, around 11 o'clock, I was carrying the late tea service upstairs when I heard voices from Lady Thornfield's study. Her ladyship was speaking sharp-like, the way she did when someone had proper vexed her. But the other voice, it weren't Mr. Pemberton's, sir. It was deeper, angrier sounding." "What time did these voices cease?" Poirot asked with gentle urgency. "Just before the clock struck 11:30, sir. Then everything went quiet." The testimony shattered our understanding completely. If Lady Thornfield was alive and arguing with someone at 11:30, and multiple witnesses placed Pemberton in the kitchen until that same time, his midnight confession became not merely improbable but physically impossible. Poirot rose slowly, his expression transforming from puzzlement to grim comprehension. "Inspector, we are not dealing with a simple murder committed by a faithful servant. We are confronting a masterpiece of deception, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to sacrifice an innocent man while protecting the true killer." The mechanical confession, the conveniently discovered evidence, the impossible timeline, the surgical precision of the wound, all pointed to a conspiracy far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Someone in Thornfield House possessed both the medical knowledge to commit such a precise murder and the psychological cunning to manipulate poor Pemberton into accepting blame for a crime he could not possibly have committed. The question now, Poirot murmured, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, is not who killed Lady Thornfield, but who has been clever enough to convince a loyal butler to destroy his own life protecting them. The revelation that Pemberton's confession was physically impossible sent a visible tremor through Inspector Meadows's professional composure. He stood in the corridor, tugging at his collar with the uncomfortable realization that his tidy solution had crumbled into contradictory fragments. "Are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot," he said slowly, "that we have been deliberately misled? That someone has orchestrated this entire confession? I suggest, mon ami, that when facts refuse to align with confessions, we must examine not the facts, but the motives behind the confessions." Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. "A man does not confess to murder from madness alone. There must be a compelling reason, a force more powerful than his own self-preservation." We returned immediately to question Pemberton, but found his condition markedly deteriorated since our last interview. The mechanical repetition continued, but his hands trembled visibly, and dark shadows beneath his eyes spoke of a man tormented by inner conflict. When Poirot gently mentioned the kitchen maid's testimony, placing him elsewhere during the crucial time, a flash of confusion crossed the butler's features before the familiar refrain resumed. "I killed Lady Thornfield, with the letter opener, in the study." "Mr. Pemberton," Poirot said with unusual gentleness, "someone you care about deeply is in danger, no? Someone whose safety depends entirely upon your confession?" The terror that flashed in Pemberton's pale blue eyes was unmistakable, confirming Poirot's suspicion that the confession was not born of guilt, but of desperate protection. Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Briggs approached with obvious reluctance, wringing her hands nervously. "Gentlemen, there's something else about last night that's been troubling me. Around midnight, just before Mr. Pemberton left for the village, I glimpsed someone in the garden, a figure moving near the study's French doors." "Could you identify this person?" Poirot inquired with sharp attention. "Too dark, sir, and they wore a dark coat with the collar turned up. But they moved with purpose, like someone familiar with the grounds. When I looked again moments later, they had vanished completely." This mysterious figure provided another crucial piece of the puzzle, suggesting that while Pemberton was making his midnight confession, the real perpetrator was still present, possibly ensuring their deception remained intact. Poirot decided to employ what he termed the psychological pressure. Rather than accuse directly, he would present the new evidence systematically to each suspect and observe their reactions with the keen eye of a naturalist studying specimens. We found Charles Thornfield in the drawing room, nursing a brandy with hands that showed fresh scratches, evidence of recent contact with thorny hedges. His earlier agitation had been replaced by brittle composure that cracked visibly when Poirot spoke. "Monsieur Thornfield, we have discovered that Lady Thornfield was sedated with chloral hydrate before her death, and the wound itself indicates a perpetrator with considerable anatomical knowledge." Charles's face drained of color, and his grip tightened around his glass. "Sedated? But who would—" "Are you implying a medical professional?" His gaze darted nervously toward the guest wing. "If Pemberton is innocent, then the real murderer remains free. This complicates everything, doesn't it?" His concern seemed less focused on justice for Pemberton than on the renewed uncertainty and potential for prolonged investigation. Most telling was his immediate attempt to deflect suspicion toward Dr. Hartwell. Miss Diana Marsh received the news in the conservatory, where she tended wilting orchids with trembling hands. Her reaction was carefully controlled shock, but Poirot's keen observation noted a slight hesitation before she expressed sympathy for the butler. "You mentioned Lady Thornfield specifically requested Pemberton's presence around 10:30, Poirot reminded her gently. "Yet we now know she was arguing with someone, a man with a deeper, angrier voice, around 11 o'clock. Can you reconcile these accounts?" Miss Marsh's composure faltered significantly. "An argument, but I heard nothing. Lady Margaret retired early. She wouldn't have been arguing at that hour." Her denial came too swiftly, too absolutely, and her gaze darted away with sudden anxiety. Dr. Hartwell, when presented with the same evidence, maintained his professional demeanor with almost clinical detachment. Fascinating. Chloral hydrate would explain the lack of struggle, and the wound suggests anatomical knowledge, certainly, but not necessarily a trained hand, merely a steady one with clear understanding of the target. When pressed about the mysterious argument, he frowned thoughtfully. "I heard nothing from my room. But if Lady Thornfield was already sedated, how could she have engaged in heated discussion? The sequence of events becomes quite complex, doesn't it?" His readiness to offer plausible explanations that subtly deflected suspicion from his medical expertise struck Poirot as particularly calculated. As we concluded these interviews, Poirot's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Each of them, Hastings, presents a carefully constructed facade. Charles, eager to redirect suspicion elsewhere. Miss Marsh, feigning ignorance of crucial details. Dr. Hartwell, too prepared with explanations that minimize his unique qualifications for this crime." "But which one is our murderer?" I asked. "Patience, mon ami. The psychological pressure has only begun. Already the cracks appear in their composure. Soon someone will make the fatal error that exposes the entire elaborate deception." His green eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "The murderer believes they have created the perfect crime, complete with a willing scapegoat. They have not anticipated that Hercule Poirot refuses to accept convenient solutions when inconvenient truths demand investigation." The net was tightening, and somewhere in Thornfield House, a killer was beginning to realize that their midnight confession might not provide the protection they had so carefully orchestrated. The psychological pressure Poirot had initiated began to yield results more swiftly than anticipated. By the following morning, the carefully maintained facades within Thornfield House showed visible cracks, like fine porcelain subjected to sudden temperature changes. Mrs. Briggs approached us in the breakfast room with obvious distress, her usually composed demeanor replaced by nervous agitation. "Gentlemen, something most peculiar occurred yesterday evening. Miss Marsh came to the kitchen asking about sleeping draughts. Said she couldn't rest with all this terrible business. When I offered chamomile tea, she insisted she needed something stronger, something medical-like, most unlike her usual preference for natural remedies." This development suggested our questioning had indeed rattled someone's composure, though whether Miss Marsh sought genuine relief or attempted to establish some form of alibi remained unclear. More intriguing was the connection it created between her and Dr. Hartwell, two individuals who claimed minimal interaction beyond polite social exchanges. Our speculation was interrupted by young Sarah, the kitchen maid, who appeared with Mrs. Briggs, her face pale with anxiety. "Please, sir, there's something about Mr. Pemberton's coat, the one with the blood. Yesterday morning it was clean in his wardrobe, but around tea time I saw someone coming from the servants' wing, someone who shouldn't have been there." "Who did you observe?" Poirot asked with characteristic gentleness. "I can't be certain, sir. They wore a dark cloak with the hood pulled up, moving quick-like down the back stairs, but the height, the way they carried themselves, it weren't one of the servants, I'm sure of that." This revelation transformed our understanding completely. The blood-stained coat had not been carelessly left by Pemberton, but deliberately planted by someone seeking to create false evidence. The mysterious cloaked figure represented another piece of the elaborate deception designed to frame the innocent butler. Armed with this knowledge, Poirot requested another interview with Pemberton, this time approaching the broken man with a different strategy entirely. Instead of questioning the confession, he spoke with infinite compassion about protection and sacrifice. "Mr. Pemberton, you have served this family with remarkable loyalty for 37 years. Such devotion creates powerful bonds, does it not? Bonds that might compel a man to make great sacrifices to protect those he cherishes." The butler's mechanical repetition faltered for the first time, his pale eyes filling with tears he struggled to contain. "I killed Lady Thornfield," he whispered, but the words carried no conviction, only desperate anguish. "Someone you love deeply is in terrible danger," Poirot continued with gentle authority. "Someone whose safety depends upon your silence, your willingness to accept blame for a crime you did not commit. But consider this, mon ami. Will your sacrifice truly protect them or merely delay their inevitable exposure?" Pemberton's composure cracked visibly, his hands trembling as he struggled with internal torment. The years of faithful service, the weight of his terrible secret, the love that compelled his sacrifice, all warred in his weathered features. "Tell me," Poirot pressed softly, "who has such power over you? What hold do they possess that makes you willing to surrender your life?" Before Pemberton could respond, Dr. Hartwell appeared in the doorway with his medical bag, his expression one of professional concern. "Gentlemen, I believe Mr. Pemberton requires immediate sedation. This interrogation is causing severe psychological distress." The timing of the doctor's intervention struck Poirot as remarkably convenient, arriving precisely when the butler seemed ready to break his silence. Moreover, Hartwell's immediate suggestion of sedation would effectively silence Pemberton for hours, preventing any potential revelations. "That will not be necessary, Doctor," Poirot replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "Mr. Pemberton was merely experiencing natural emotion regarding his situation. Nevertheless, as a medical professional, I must insist—" "You are Lady Thornfield's physician," Poirot interrupted sharply, "and she is beyond your care. Mr. Pemberton requires no medical intervention at this time." The brief confrontation revealed much about Dr. Hartwell's eagerness to control access to the butler, suggesting a vested interest in maintaining Pemberton's silence. His professional authority was being wielded as a shield for more sinister purposes. As the doctor reluctantly departed, his face flushed with barely concealed anger, Poirot turned back to the trembling butler with renewed determination. The atmosphere in the small room had grown thick with tension, charged with the electricity of impending revelation. "The truth will emerge regardless of your sacrifice, mon ami," Poirot said quietly. "Would it not be better to speak now, while your cooperation might still provide protection for the person you seek to shield?" Pemberton raised his tear-stained face, and in that moment the dam of his resolve finally began to crack. The mechanical confession that had protected his secret was crumbling, and with it, the carefully constructed facade that had concealed the real murderer's identity. The dam of Pemberton's resolve finally burst, with devastating completeness, 37 years of faithful service crumbling beneath the weight of a father's desperate love. His tear-stained face lifted toward Poirot with the raw anguish of a man whose carefully guarded secret had become his prison. "She's my daughter," he whispered, the words torn from his very soul. "Diana, Miss Marsh, she's my daughter, born when I was barely 20, before I entered service here. Her mother died when Diana was small, and I couldn't care for her properly on a butler's wages." The revelation struck with the force of lightning, illuminating the entire mystery in a single, brilliant flash. Diana Marsh, the refined companion with her educated speech and cultured mannerisms, was the secret daughter of the man now prepared to die for her protection. "I gave her to my sister in London," Pemberton continued, his voice gaining strength as the long-held secret finally emerged. "My sister was married to a schoolmaster. They could provide education, refinement, everything I couldn't offer. Diana became a lady's companion, while I remained in service, sending what money I could for her upbringing. And Lady Thornfield never suspected this relationship. Poirot asked with characteristic gentleness. Never. When Diana applied for the companion position 7 years ago, I said nothing. Lady Thornfield valued discretion above all else, and my personal connections would have been seen as deception. Diana and I maintained the pretense of mere professional acquaintance, though it broke my heart daily to see her and remain silent. The psychological torment became clear. A father watching his beloved daughter struggle with financial insecurity, knowing that his revelation of their relationship would cost them both their positions and destroy her carefully constructed identity. The new will would have provided Miss Marsh with independence, I realized suddenly, but the original will leaves her with nothing. Exactly. Pemberton nodded miserably. When Lady Thornfield died before signing the new will, Diana faced immediate dismissal without reference or provision. She would have been destitute, her reputation in service destroyed by association with the scandal. But even as this emotional revelation provided motive for the butler's sacrifice, Poirot's sharp mind immediately identified the crucial inconsistency. Your desire to protect Mademoiselle Diana is admirable and understandable, he said carefully. But it does not explain how she could have committed murder requiring medical precision, or why she would possess chloral hydrate to sedate Lady Thornfield. Before Pemberton could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Dr. Hartwell appeared once more, his expression thunderous with barely controlled rage. This interrogation has continued long enough. Mr. Pemberton is clearly experiencing a complete mental breakdown, fabricating elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting responsibility for his actions. On the contrary, Doctor, Poirot replied with dangerous quietness, Mr. Pemberton has finally begun to reveal the truth. Perhaps you would care to explain your own role in this elaborate deception? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired pistol. Dr. Hartwell's professional composure cracked visibly, his face flushing with guilt and fury. I have no idea what you're suggesting. My only concern is for the welfare of a clearly disturbed individual. Your concern extends to discovering the relationship between Pemberton and Diana Marsh, to using your medical knowledge to strike with surgical precision, to manipulating a desperate father's love to create the perfect scapegoat for your crime. The pieces of the conspiracy became clear with devastating logic. Dr. Hartwell had discovered the secret relationship through careful observation over the years, perhaps through medical records, or simply by noting the subtle resemblances and interactions between father and daughter. When Lady Thornfield's new will threatened his own financial expectations, the substantial bequest for his medical research, he saw the perfect opportunity. You murdered Lady Thornfield to prevent the new will's execution, Poirot continued relentlessly, knowing that her death would restore the original will's provisions. But you needed a scapegoat, someone who could be manipulated into accepting blame. Pemberton's desperate love for his secret daughter provided the perfect leverage. Pemberton's face crumpled with the full realization of how completely he had been deceived. He told me Diana would be arrested. That suspicion had already fallen on her. Said only my confession could save her from the gallows. Dr. Hartwell's hand moved instinctively toward his medical bag, and in that gesture, Poirot read confirmation of his suspicions. The same surgical precision that had killed Lady Thornfield now threatened to claim new victims in a final, desperate attempt to preserve his murderous secret. Come, Hastings, Poirot said with quiet authority, his green eyes never leaving the doctor's face. It is time to gather all our suspects for the final act of this elaborate performance. Dr. Hartwell has demonstrated remarkable skill in psychological manipulation. Let us see how he responds when the roles are reversed. The drawing room of Thornfield House had witnessed countless gatherings over the decades, but none quite so charged with desperate tension as the assembly Poirot orchestrated that evening. The autumn light had faded to a pale wash against the tall windows, casting long shadows across the carefully arranged chairs, where the surviving members of Lady Thornfield's final birthday celebration now sat in positions that seemed almost theatrical in their precision. Charles Thornfield occupied a chair near the fireplace, his nervous energy barely contained beneath a veneer of aristocratic composure. Diana Marsh sat rigidly in a corner chair, her refined features masking the deep anxiety that had been building since our arrival. Dr. Hartwell positioned himself by the window, his medical bag within easy reach. A detail that did not escape Poirot's keen observation. Inspector Meadows stood near the door, his earlier confidence in the case's resolution now replaced by watchful uncertainty, while Pemberton sat apart from the others, his weathered face reflecting the exhaustion of a man whose terrible secret had finally been exposed. Poirot positioned himself in the center of the room with characteristic precision, his green eyes surveying each face with the intensity of a master craftsman examining his most delicate work. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 o'clock, its resonant notes seeming to herald the final act of the elaborate drama that had begun with a midnight confession. "Mesdames, Messieurs," Poirot began with formal courtesy, "we are gathered to resolve a mystery that has masqueraded as simplicity itself, a faithful butler's confession to murdering his beloved employer. But as we have discovered, the truth lies buried beneath layers of deception, psychological manipulation, and the cruelest possible exploitation of human love." Charles Thornfield shifted uncomfortably. Surely Pemberton's confession settles the matter. All this speculation seems rather excessive. On the contrary, Monsieur Charles, the confession itself is the most elaborate deception of all. Poirot's voice carried quiet authority. Let us examine the facts methodically, as they refuse to align with our butler's mechanical repetition of guilt. He began to pace slowly, his movements as deliberate as his words. First, the timeline. Young Sarah, the kitchen maid, heard Lady Thornfield engaged in heated argument at 11 o'clock with a man whose voice was deeper, angrier sounding than Pemberton's. Yet multiple witnesses placed Pemberton in the kitchen until nearly 11:30. He could not have been in two places simultaneously. Inspector Meadows nodded grimly. The timeline makes his confession physically impossible. Precisely. Second, the murder itself required surgical precision. A letter opener driven directly to the heart between the ribs, requiring both anatomical knowledge and a steady hand. Dr. Hartwell confirmed that Lady Thornfield had been sedated with chloral hydrate, explaining the absence of struggle or defensive wounds. She was rendered helpless, unable to resist or cry out. Dr. Hartwell remained motionless by the window, but his knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on his medical bag. Third, the so-called physical evidence. Poirot continued with gentle irony. The blood-stained overcoat, discovered so conveniently in Pemberton's wardrobe. Yet we have testimony that this coat was clean the morning after the murder, and that a mysterious cloaked figure was seen entering the servants' wing shortly before its discovery. A meticulous man like Pemberton would never leave such incriminating evidence carelessly displayed. Diana Marsh gasped audibly, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. But the most crucial element, Poirot said, his voice growing gentler, is the psychological lever used to compel our butler's false confession. Pemberton sacrificed himself, not from guilt, but from desperate love, the love of a father for his daughter. The revelation struck the room like lightning. Diana's eyes flew to Pemberton's face, years of hidden affection and subtle protectiveness, suddenly explained in that single, devastating moment. "Yes, Mademoiselle Diana," Poirot confirmed gently. "Pemberton is your father, a secret he has guarded for 37 years, while watching over you from the shadows. When you became Lady Thornfield's companion, he thought it providence, never imagining that this secret would become the weapon used to destroy him. Pemberton's composure finally broke completely. "I gave you to my sister when you were small," he whispered. "I wanted you to have education, refinement, everything I couldn't provide on a butler's wages. Watching you become a lady while remaining silent, it broke my heart daily." And this secret, Poirot continued, his gaze settling with devastating focus on Dr. Hartwell, was discovered by someone trained to observe human nature, to note family resemblances and private confidences. Someone whose own financial expectations were threatened by Lady Thornfield's new will. Not Charles, whose inheritance would merely be reduced, but someone who stood to lose everything. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired pistol. Dr. Hartwell's professional mask began to slip, revealing the cold calculation beneath his benevolent exterior. "You murdered Lady Thornfield to prevent the new will's execution," Poirot stated with quiet certainty, then manipulated a desperate father's love to create the perfect scapegoat. "The game is nearly finished, Doctor. Soon we shall see how you respond when the roles are finally reversed." Dr. Hartwell's carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the weight of Poirot's relentless logic, his professional mask slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. The drawing room fell into tense silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and Diana Marsh's stifled sob as she realized the full scope of the manipulation that had nearly destroyed her father. "Your accusations are preposterous," Hartwell declared, but his voice carried none of its usual authority. "I am a respected physician, not some common murderer." "Indeed, you are no common murderer," Poirot replied with devastating precision. "You are far more dangerous, a man who perverted his medical knowledge and social position to commit what you believed would be the perfect crime. Let us examine your methodology, Doctor, with the same clinical detachment you applied to your victim." Poirot began to pace slowly, his movements as deliberate as his words. First, the motive. Lady Thornfield's new will would have diverted substantial funds from your medical research project, funds you had already begun to appropriate through careful manipulation of her charitable accounts. She had grown suspicious of certain discrepancies, had she not? The morning after her birthday, she planned to review these accounts with Mr. Blackwood. The solicitor nodded grimly. She had indeed expressed concerns about irregular transactions in recent months. Faced with exposure and the loss of your expected inheritance, you saw only one solution, Poirot continued. Lady Thornfield's death before the new will could be signed would restore the original provisions and eliminate the threat of discovery. But the method required careful planning. As her physician, you had both access to chloral hydrate and the medical knowledge to administer it without immediate suspicion. During your evening visit, you sedated her under the guise of treating her birthday nerves. When you returned at 11 o'clock through the French doors, she was drowsy, unable to resist effectively. Inspector Meadows leaned forward intently. The argument young Sarah overheard. "Your final attempt at persuasion, Inspector. When Lady Thornfield refused to delay the will signing, you struck with surgical precision, the letter opener driven directly to the heart between the ribs, requiring both anatomical knowledge and steady hands." "This is pure speculation," Hartwell protested, but his hand moved unconsciously toward his medical bag. "Is it?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Then perhaps you can explain the presence of this." He moved to Hartwell's medical bag and, with Inspector Meadows' assistance, withdrew a small brown bottle. "Chloral hydrate from your personal stock, Doctor. The laboratory will confirm it matches the residue found in Lady Thornfield's evening draught." The physical evidence struck the room like lightning, but Poirot was not finished. The locked room was simple misdirection. You left through the French doors, latching them from outside with a thin wire, then circled back to establish your alibi. But your masterpiece was the psychological manipulation. His voice grew heavy with disgust. You discovered Pemberton's secret through years of observation, the subtle resemblances, the hidden moments of paternal concern. When you needed a scapegoat, you exploited that love with surgical precision. You told him Diana was under suspicion, that only his confession could save her from the gallows. Pemberton's voice broke with anguish. He showed me evidence, said her fingerprints were on the letter opener, that she'd been seen arguing with Lady Thornfield. What father wouldn't believe such things? And while poor Pemberton walked to the village to make his impossible confession, Poirot continued, you returned to plant the blood-stained overcoat, using Lady Thornfield's blood from the murder weapon to create false evidence. Dr. Hartwell's composure shattered completely. You understand nothing about the importance of medical research. Lady Thornfield was wasting thousands on sentimental nonsense while genuine scientific advancement went unfunded. So you murdered her, Inspector Meadows stated grimly, moving forward with handcuffs. I preserved her legacy for something meaningful, Hartwell snarled, his true nature finally exposed. But his desperate lunge for the remaining chloral hydrate was intercepted by the inspector's swift action. As the constables led the broken physician away, Diana crossed the room to take her father's weathered hands in hers. All these years, she whispered, tears streaming down her face, you protected me without my ever knowing. Pemberton's composure finally broke completely. I wanted you to have everything I couldn't provide, education, refinement, respectability, watching you become a lady while remaining silent. It broke my heart daily. Later, as we prepared to leave Thornfield House, I reflected on the case's resolution. Another murderer exposed, Poirot. You must be satisfied. He shook his head slowly. Satisfied with justice, perhaps. But there is no pleasure in contemplating how easily human greed disguises itself as noble purpose. Dr. Hartwell corrupted his healing gifts, transforming medicine into murder. As our motor car pulled away from the great house, Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. The most dangerous criminals, mon ami, are not those who act from passion, but those who calculate human weakness as precisely as they would measure a pharmaceutical dose. They understand that love, twisted properly, becomes the sharpest weapon of all. The case of the butler's midnight confession was closed, but its lessons about the corruption of trust and the exploitation of love would linger long in the memory. A reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that even the most carefully constructed deceptions must eventually yield to the persistent application of logic and the inexorable demands of justice. The drawing room fell into profound silence as Dr. Hartwell was led away, his professional mask finally stripped away to reveal the calculating murderer beneath. Diana Marsh crossed immediately to Pemberton, taking his weathered hands in hers with tears streaming down her face. For the first time in 37 years, father and daughter could acknowledge their bond openly, without fear or deception. All these years, she whispered, you watched over me without my knowing. The kindnesses I attributed to Lady Thornfield's generosity, were they from you? Pemberton nodded, his voice breaking. Every opportunity I could provide without revealing our connection. When you became her companion, I thought it Providence itself, never imagining this secret would nearly destroy us both. Charles Thornfield, who had remained silent during the dramatic revelation, stepped forward with uncharacteristic humility. Miss Marsh, Diana, I owe you both an apology. I was prepared to see an innocent man hang rather than risk my inheritance. He paused, gathering courage. I've instructed Mr. Blackwood to draft a codicil. Though Aunt Margaret's new will was never signed, I intend to honor her wishes regarding the servants' bequests and your provision. Inspector Meadows completed the formal proceedings with efficiency, born of relief. Dr. Hartwell would face trial for murder, the evidence overwhelming. The chloral hydrate matching Lady Thornfield's blood chemistry, his desperate attempts to silence Pemberton, and the planted evidence he had used to frame an innocent man. The case that had begun with an impossible confession would end with justice properly served. As our motor car wound through the Surrey countryside toward London, Poirot remained thoughtfully silent, occasionally adjusting his moustache, a sure sign his analytical mind was processing the psychological complexities we had witnessed. The autumn landscape blurred past in shades of gold and amber, providing a peaceful counterpoint to the darkness we were leaving behind. "Tell me, Hastings," he said eventually, "what disturbed you most about this affair?" I considered carefully. The calculated cruelty of it all. Dr. Hartwell didn't simply commit murder. He perverted the deepest human bonds to serve his purposes. The love between father and daughter, the trust between physician and patient, all became weapons in his hands. Precisely. It is one thing to kill for passion, another entirely to orchestrate the destruction of innocent souls for personal gain. Poirot's voice carried unusual gravity. Dr. Hartwell understood that Pemberton would sacrifice everything for his daughter's safety. Such love should be sacred, yet he transformed it into a tool of manipulation. The irony was particularly bitter. Had Dr. Hartwell simply allowed events to proceed naturally, Lady Thornfield's new will would have provided handsomely for his medical research. His greed and fear of exposure had destroyed the very future he sought to protect. "What will become of Diana and Pemberton now?" I asked. "Charles has agreed to honor his aunt's intended bequests despite their legal invalidity. Diana will receive sufficient funds to establish that bookshop she dreamed of, while Pemberton will retire with dignity. Father and daughter can finally build the relationship that deception nearly destroyed." As the familiar sights of London came into view, Poirot's mood grew more philosophical. "You know, mon ami, this case exemplifies why I've always preferred the study of human psychology to the examination of physical evidence. Fingerprints and bloodstains can be fabricated, but the human heart, that reveals truths that cannot be counterfeited. Yet Dr. Hartwell nearly succeeded. Nearly, yes, but ultimately he failed because he underestimated the power of genuine emotion. Pemberton's love for his daughter was real, as was his fundamental honesty. The mechanical nature of his confession betrayed its artificial origin. A truly guilty man would have provided details, justifications, the complex psychology of actual remorse. Our comfortable lodgings awaited as afternoon shadows lengthened across Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson's excellent tea and the peaceful routine of domestic life provided welcome contrast to the darker aspects of human nature we encountered in our investigations. "One final observation, Hastings," Poirot said as we climbed the familiar stairs. "Dr. Hartwell's greatest error was not in the commission of his crime, but in his assumption that others shared his capacity for calculated deception. He could not comprehend that Pemberton's confession arose from love rather than guilt, because such selfless devotion was foreign to his own nature." As I settled into my chair, I reflected on the case's broader implications. The midnight confession had been both the beginning and the end of the deception, meant to close the case before investigation could begin, yet ultimately providing the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The guilty party revealed himself, Poirot observed with satisfaction, not through his crime, but through his eagerness to accept an impossible solution. In the end, Hastings, truth and justice prevailed, as they always must when confronted by the relentless application of logic and the unwavering commitment to protect the innocent. The case of the butler's midnight confession was closed, its lessons enduring, a reminder that the greatest crimes are often committed through the calculated exploitation of humanity's finest instincts, but that love and truth, when properly defended, prove stronger than any deception.